Welcome back to the Mookie Chilson channel, and you are looking live at the Drew A Vintage Legacy. And if you're subscribed to this channel, then you're more than likely subscribed to the Drew A Vintage Legacy. And if you're like me, it's because you really appreciate the content that Drew produces. He doesn't just show off his memorabilia and cardboard, but he gives you a sort of multiple layers and depths of the nostalgia and the reasons for the feelings that we have behind what we do. And he has incredible facts about different stories that maybe you didn't know. And he weaves it all together in just an amazing product that I consume every episode of very eagerly when they come out, including this VR contest. He wants us to show our franchise player, a player that played for one team over maybe a short period of time, or it could be their whole career, but it should be for one team. And this is his 100 video episode VR contest. In his case, he picked Pee Wee Reese. In my case, I'm going to break the rules, and I'm a rule breaker, but breaking the spirit, the letter of the law, and not the spirit of the law. And I hope you will stick with me through this and understand why I'm doing what I'm doing. And how it works. But I'm going to change the slide here and show you my franchise player, and it's the man on the left, Santa Claus. This is inside a children's hospital in the year 1949. These two young boys here are suffering from polio, which was a massive problem at the time, and they got a Christmas pick-me-up visit from Santa Claus. And if you're like these two kids, you can probably tell Santa has pulled down his beard, and it is not the real Santa who is up in the North Pole, but it is Brooklyn Dodgers slugging first baseman Gil Hodges. Gil Hodges was a baseball icon in the 40s and 50s and 60s, but he was maybe the most iconic member of the Brooklyn Dodgers for his involvement and in the community, and for what he did and how the fans treated and loved him. And after he was inducted into the Hall of Fame recently, there was a lot written about what he meant to Brooklyn and why, including in this New York Times piece, which I'm going to read from here. Beneficence was at the core of Hodges, and it seeped into his game. He knew his role, hitting the ball for distance, and he stuck to it. For the first baseman, driving in a runner from third was more important than hitting for average. And to this day, he holds the major league record for most sacrifices in a season with 19 in 1954. And I'll show off my 1954 Topps card of Gil. And there he is. This may have been on the wall of one of these youngsters, for all I know. But this is a pinhole card extraordinaire from my Hall of Fame. But it wasn't enough for Gil to help his team. Hodges also felt a personal responsibility to help his community. And in the era of multi-million-dollar contracts, it's hard to imagine an all-star first baseman going out of his way to drive a postman that he'd recently met to his home in Mill Basin, or donating $500 to a Jewish day school that had been vandalized. It's even harder to imagine that these acts were done quietly and not out of a desire to self-promote. But by all accounts, Gil's intentions were pure. According to his biographer, he couldn't just drive past the bus stop and leave someone without giving him a lift. Most would have driven by, but Gil did not. He stopped. There must be countless examples of him doing this kind of thing that we're not aware of, acts of kindness that are lost to time. Well, thankfully, the photo in front of you is not lost to time. The young man on the right shared it with the New York Times. And so we all know about this visit Gil made to the Children's Hospital in 1949. As far as his on-the-field exploits, Gil Hodges was a rookie. His first appearance for the Dodgers was in 1943, on the last game of the season. And he was a 19-year-old kid. He played third base. He went 0 for 2 with a walk and a stolen base, and he made a couple of errors. And for all we knew, that was going to be the last, that could have been the last we ever saw of Gil Hodges, because right after the season, he enlisted in the United States Marine Corps and went off to war in the Pacific. And Gil spent 2 years in the service, and he was not any kind of celebrity there. He saw actual action and was in some stuff. including the Battle of Okinawa, which was one of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific Theater, where a lot of Americans were killed before the island was taken. And when it was taken, his daughter notes in his Hall of Fame speech that Gil felt a responsibility to help out the kids of the island and taught young Japanese children how to play baseball, to give them a little bit of hope and a little bit of joy in their lives in that incredible war-torn country. So that was the kind of person that Gil Hodges was. Anyway, so he joined back in the major leagues in 1947. He was right there with Jackie Robinson. Jackie Robinson came up in April of 1947. Gil Hodges came up in May of 1947 as a catcher. Gil was a catcher until Roy Campanella took his job the next year, and Gil moved over to first base. But he was an incredible slugging first baseman, very powerful, more than 300 home runs. He made all-star games all the time. He and Duke Snider, I think, have the most home runs of the decade of the 50s. He was great. He was a great ball player. And he also stood up for his teammates. Again, he and Jackie Robinson were great friends. Their children played together and grew up together. Jackie was like a part of Gil's family. And when people would threaten Jackie and taunt Jackie and do all kinds of nasty things, there was a story his daughter tells again of Gil standing up on the dugout steps and screaming to the other team that if anybody wants to take a run at Jackie, you got to come through me first. And of course, the other team would back down because Gil was one tough son of a bitch. And so he meant the world to his teammates. He meant the world to the community. Again, Gil was a devout Catholic who went to church every Sunday. In fact, there was a parish in Brooklyn that one time when Gil was struggling, he'd gone 0 for 21 at the plate. The priest basically canceled his sermon on a hot summer morning and said that you should go home and pray for Gil Hodges. Brooklyn loved Gil Hodges. They did not boo him at Ebbets Field. He was one of the, dem bums that really connected with the community. And so you could imagine when this team was torn from those fans in 1957 and moved to the West Coast, the devastation that was felt among the fan base, that their wonderful Brooklyn Dodgers were gone, and Gil Hodges, of all people, included. Gil would go on to win the World Series with the Dodgers in LA in 1959. But in 1961, when a new National League franchise was being planned in New York, the owners of the Mets were no dummies. They knew what Gil meant to that town, and they took him in the expansion draft with the 7th pick that the Mets had. And there he is. Well, you can't see. This is the first vintage card I ever owned. This was given to me when I was about 10 years old at a baseball card show. One of the dealers knew I was a Mets fan, and so he gave me this beat-up old New York Mets 1963 Topps card. But Gil is in there somewhere. This is one of those cards look at the guys in the back row. They look like somebody painted a face on a thumb. So this is the Topps artwork. But Gil's in there somewhere. But this is my 1963 Topps Gil Hodges, which I just got a couple weeks ago. And this is Gil Hodges. This was the day that the Mets debuted their uniforms. The pinstripes, the blue hats, the orange NY. It was an amalgam of the New York teams, and an invitation to fans to, if you were a Giants fan or a Dodgers fan, come root for these Mets. These are your new team. And the Mets fans embraced this team. In fact, Gil Hodges, in the first game the Mets ever played, Gil Hodges hit a home run. Hit the Mets' first home run in their franchise history. And when they came back to New York the next day, the mayor threw a ticker tape parade for this team. This was a team that lost 120 games that year, but before they ever played a game in front of their fans, they had a ticker tape parade down Broadway in New York City. And Gil Hodges was one of the most celebrated people on that parade route. So anyway, Gil Hodges retired in 1963, went to go manage the Washington Senators, and eventually the Mets were hoping they could bring him back, and they brought Gil Hodges back as the manager of the 1968 New York Mets. And the fans loved it, and the team did not necessarily love it as much. Gil was a United States Marine. This is my 1968 tops, by the way, from Dylan Double D. And he had a different view. He wanted to institute platoons all over the field. He had high expectations. He demanded a different clubhouse culture than had existed before. And he got the team clicking and winning, and when they did in 1969, we all know the Miracle Mets won the World Series, and Gil got his second parade down the streets of New York, down Broadway. There he is, and that's his wife. Like I said, Gil's family never left Brooklyn, and so Gil got to come home to New York and really enjoy the fans and the city that he loved. And it was just a beautiful thing to see him succeed in the place of his original glory. And the fans just loved him. And so Gil would go on to manage in 70 and 1971, and win, I think, 83 games in each of those years. And then in the spring of 1972, Gil Hodges was out playing golf during spring training, and he collapsed and had a heart attack at age 47. It was a sudden, shocking, calamitous death that was felt so profoundly in this city that he had, returned to as a conquering hero. But it was, of course, profoundly awful for everyone who loved him, including his family, of course. And at the funeral, his son tells a story about how, his funeral, which was attended by masses and masses of people in Brooklyn, his son tells a story of how Howard Cosell, who was a friend of the family, tapped him on the shoulder at one point during the service and said, "You better come outside, someone wants to see you." And so he brought Gil Hodges Jr. out to a limousine outside the church, opened the door, and he went in and sat down next to Jackie Robinson, who, according to Gil Hodges Jr., was sobbing, crying, and told Gil Hodges Jr. that next to his own son dying, this was the worst day of his life. That's how much Gil Hodges meant to Jackie Robinson. That's how much he meant to Brooklyn. That's how much he meant to the Mets. That's how much he meant to the city. And the Mets would eventually go on to retire his number. Gil Hodges would wait decades. The Hodges family would campaign for decades to get him into the Hall of Fame. And eventually he did make it into the Hall of Fame. And right after he went into the Hall of Fame, the Los Angeles Dodgers retired his number as well. And as I'm going to read you a quote from the New York Times, this is another Times article, about what Gil Hodges meant to both these franchises. And it reads, "Main characters recede and others emerge, and then it repeats all over again. But the strongest and most consistent connection between the Dodgers and the Mets remains Gil Hodges, the late newly elected Hall of Famer, whose number 14 was retired by the Dodgers in a pre-game ceremony on Saturday night. The Mets had retired his same number in 1973. And according to Vin Scully, the legendary Dodgers broadcaster, who, of course, was with Gil Hodges in Brooklyn and went to go be with him in Los Angeles when they played out there, here's the quote. He was indeed, I was going to say the thread, but he wasn't the thread. He was the iron steel cable connecting the Brooklyn Dodgers and the New York Mets. And I would volunteer that it was almost the same franchise. There is some connective tissue. In fact, the steel cable running between these two franchises that makes Gil Hodges a franchise player in a certain special way. So that's it. That's the end of my video. I'm going to stop blubbering and end this here. Thank you for watching. Gil Hodges, thank you for making me think of this VR contest to the Drew, and have a great day. Thank you.